In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, life moved at a slow pace. The people there knew each other by name, and stories of the past were often shared over cups of tea or during lazy afternoons at the local market. But there was one story no one talked about, a story that had been buried for decades, waiting for someone to uncover it. The story began with an old man who lived on the outskirts of the town. He was a quiet figure, often seen sitting on his porch, staring into the distance. His face was lined with age, and his eyes carried a weight that no one could quite understand. The townsfolk knew him as a kind but reserved man who kept to himself. He rarely spoke about his past, and no one ever asked. To them, he was just another elderly man living out his days in peace. But the old man had a secret, one that even he had tried to forget. Decades ago, he had been a soldier, fighting in a war that had taken so much from him. He had seen things no one should ever see, lost friends he would never forget, and carried scars, both visible and hidden, that never fully healed. When the war ended, he returned home, but the world had moved on without him. The heroes were celebrated, but he was not among them. Over time, his story faded into obscurity, and he became just another face in the crowd. Years turned into decades, and the old man's life became a routine of solitude. He spent his days tending to his small garden, reading old books, and occasionally visiting the town for supplies. He never married, had no children, and had no close family left. To the outside world, he was a man with no history, no legacy. But deep down, he carried the memories of a life that had once been filled with purpose and sacrifice. One day, a stranger arrived in town. He was a young man, in his late 20s, with a curious mind and a passion for history. He had been traveling across the country, documenting stories of war veterans before they were lost to time. His journey had brought him to this quiet town, where he had heard whispers of an old soldier who lived alone on the edge of the forest. Intrigued, the young man decided to seek him out. The stranger's arrival caused a stir in the town. People weren't used to outsiders, especially ones who asked so many questions. But the young man was polite and persistent, and eventually, someone pointed him in the direction of the old man's house. With a notebook in hand and a heart full of curiosity, he made his way down the dusty path that led to the old man's home. When he arrived, he found the old man sitting on his porch, just as he had been described. The young man hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach him. But something about the old man's quiet presence drew him in. He took a deep breath, walked up to the porch, and introduced himself. The old man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the stranger. He wasn't used to visitors, and he wasn't sure what to make of this young man standing before him. But there was something genuine in the stranger's eyes, a kindness that reminded him of someone he had known long ago. The young man explained why he had come. He spoke of his mission to preserve the stories of those who had served in the war, to ensure that their sacrifices were never forgotten. He asked if the old man would be willing to share his story. For a long moment, the old man said nothing. He simply stared into the distance, as if weighing the request in his mind. The young man waited patiently, sensing that this was a decision that couldn't be rushed. Finally, the old man nodded. He gestured for the young man to sit down, and for the first time in decades, he began to speak. His voice was soft, almost hesitant at first, as if the words had been locked away for so long that they were unsure how to come out. But as he continued, the memories began to flow, memories of a time when he was young and full of hope, of the friends he had made and lost, of the battles he had fought and the horrors he had witnessed. He spoke of the day he had been drafted, the training that had hardened him, and the journey to a foreign land where he had faced the unimaginable. The young man listened intently, his pen moving quickly across the pages of his notebook. He could feel the weight of the old man's words, the pain and pride intertwined in every sentence. It was a story that needed to be told, a story that had been hidden for far too long. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the porch, the old man paused. He looked at the young man and smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of years of silence and solitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for listening." The young man nodded, his heart heavy with emotion. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there was so much more to uncover. But for now, he was grateful for the trust the old man had placed in him. As he left the porch and made his way back to town, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary, a story that would change not only the old man's life but his own as well. And so, the journey to uncover the forgotten war hero's story began, one word at a time. The young man returned to the town that evening, his mind buzzing with everything he had heard. The old man's story was unlike anything he had encountered before. It wasn't just a tale of war, it was a story of resilience, loss, and the quiet strength of a man who had endured more than most could imagine. The young man knew he had to dig deeper, to piece together the fragments of the old man's life and bring his story to light. The next morning, he went back to the old man's house, this time with a small recorder in hand. He wanted to capture every detail, every emotion in the old man's voice. When he arrived, he found the old man sitting on the porch, just as he had the day before. This time, however, there was a faint smile on the old man's face, as if he had been expecting the young man's return. They sat together again, and the old man continued his story. He spoke of the camaraderie he had shared with his fellow soldiers, the bonds forged in the heat of battle. He described the laughter they had shared during rare moments of peace, the letters they had written to loved ones back home, and the dreams they had whispered to each other in the dark. But he also spoke of the losses, the friends who had fallen beside him, their faces forever etched in his memory. The young man listened, his heart aching with every word. He could see the pain in the old man's eyes, but he could also see the pride. The old man had been a leader, someone his comrades had looked up to. He had made decisions that had saved lives, and he had carried the weight of those decisions ever since. As the days passed, the young man visited the old man regularly. Each time, he learned something new, a detail about a battle, a memory of a friend, a moment of bravery that had gone unnoticed. The old man's story was coming together, piece by piece, like a puzzle that had been scattered for decades. But the young man knew that the story wasn't complete. He needed to find evidence, something that could corroborate the old man's account. He began to search through old records, visiting libraries and archives in nearby towns. He reached out to historians and veterans organizations, hoping to find someone who might remember the old man or his unit. It wasn't easy. The war had ended so long ago, and many of the records were incomplete or lost. But the young man was determined. He spent hours poring over dusty documents, searching for any mention of the old man's name or the battles he had described. Slowly, he began to find clues, a mention of a heroic act in an old newspaper, a faded photograph of a group of soldiers, a letter written by a fellow veteran. One day, he stumbled upon something extraordinary. In a small archive in a neighboring town, he found a detailed account of a battle that matched the old man's description. The report mentioned a young soldier who had led his unit through a dangerous mission, saving countless lives in the process. The soldier's name wasn't mentioned, but the details were too similar to be a coincidence. The young man felt a surge of excitement. He had found proof of the old man's heroism. He rushed back to the old man's house, clutching the documents in his hand. When he arrived, he found the old man sitting in his usual spot on the porch. The young man handed him the papers, his hands trembling with anticipation. The old man took them and began to read, his eyes scanning the faded text. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the old man looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "I never thought anyone would remember," he said softly. "I never thought it mattered." The young man felt a lump in his throat. "It matters," he said firmly. "Your story matters. And I'm going to make sure the world knows about it." The old man nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in decades, he felt seen, heard. The weight he had carried for so long began to lift, just a little. The young man continued his research, piecing together the old man's story with the evidence he had found. He interviewed other veterans, tracked down old photographs, and even visited the sites of the battles the old man had described. Each piece of the puzzle added depth to the story, painting a vivid picture of a man who had given everything for his country. As the days turned into weeks, the young man and the old man grew closer. They spent hours talking, not just about the war but about life, love, and the passage of time. The old man shared stories of his childhood, his dreams before the war, and the life he had built afterward. The young man listened, captivated by the wisdom and humility of the man before him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, the old man turned to the young man and said, "You've given me something I thought I'd lost, a sense of purpose." "Thank you." The young man smiled, his heart full. "No," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. For reminding me of the power of courage and resilience. Your story will inspire others. I promise." And so, the journey continued, each day bringing them closer to the truth. The old man's story was no longer forgotten, it was alive, waiting to be shared with the world. And the young man knew that he had been given a gift, a chance to honor a hero who had been overlooked for far too long. As the young man delved deeper into the old man's past, he began to realize the enormity of what he was uncovering. This wasn't just one man's story, it was a piece of history, a testament to the sacrifices made by countless others who had fought in the war. The more he learned, the more determined he became to ensure that the old man's legacy would be remembered. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old letters and photographs at the local library, the young man made a startling discovery. Among the faded papers was a letter written by a soldier who had served in the same unit as the old man. The letter described a mission that had gone terribly wrong, leaving many soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. It mentioned a young lieutenant who had risked his life to lead his men to safety, navigating through treacherous terrain under heavy fire. The lieutenant's name wasn't mentioned, but the young man had no doubt, it was the old man. He rushed back to the old man's house, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. When he arrived, he found the old man tending to his garden, his hands covered in soil. The young man approached him, holding out the letter. "I found this," he said breathlessly. "It's about you, isn't it?" The old man took the letter and read it slowly, his hands trembling slightly. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and pride. "Yes," he said quietly. "That was me. I didn't think anyone remembered." The young man sat down beside him, his heart pounding. "Tell me about it," he urged. "Tell me everything." And so, the old man began to recount the mission in detail. He spoke of the chaos and confusion, the fear that had gripped him as he realized they were surrounded. He described the moment he had made the decision to lead his men through the enemy's lines, knowing it was their only chance of survival. He spoke of the courage of his comrades, the way they had trusted him even in the face of certain death. As he spoke, the young man could see the emotions playing out on the old man's face, the fear, the determination, the grief for those who hadn't made it. It was a story of unimaginable bravery, one that had been buried for far too long. The young man spent the next few days verifying the details of the mission. He reached out to historians and military experts, cross-referencing the old man's account with official records and other veterans' testimonies. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fit together. The old man's story was not just true, it was extraordinary. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the young man turned to the old man and said, "Your story is incredible. It deserves to be told. I want to write a book about you, about everything you've been through. But I need your permission." The old man was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he nodded. "If you think it will help others understand what we went through, then yes. You have my permission." The young man felt a surge of gratitude and responsibility. He knew that this was more than just a book, it was a way to honor not only the old man but all those who had fought alongside him. He began to outline the story, weaving together the old man's memories with the historical context he had gathered. It was a daunting task, but he was determined to do it justice. As the days turned into weeks, the young man and the old man continued to work together. The old man shared more stories, some filled with triumph, others with heartbreak. He spoke of the friendships he had formed, the letters he had written to his family, and the moments of hope that had kept him going. He also spoke of the toll the war had taken on him, the nightmares that still haunted him, the guilt he carried for those he couldn't save. The young man listened, his heart heavy with the weight of the old man's words. He realized that this was more than just a story of heroism, it was a story of humanity, of the strength and fragility of the human spirit. One day, as they were going through a box of old photographs, the old man paused, holding up a faded picture of a group of young soldiers. His eyes filled with tears as he pointed to one of the faces. "That's him," he said softly. "My best friend. He didn't make it home." The young man felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the photograph. The soldiers in the picture were so young, their faces filled with hope and determination. It was a stark reminder of the sacrifices they had made, the lives that had been cut short. The old man's story was no longer just a collection of memories, it was a living, breathing testament to the cost of war. The young man knew that he had a responsibility to share it with the world, to ensure that the sacrifices of the old man and his comrades would never be forgotten. As the sun set that evening, casting a warm glow over the porch, the old man turned to the young man and said, "Thank you for giving me a chance to tell my story. For reminding me that it matters." The young man smiled, his heart full. "No," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. For reminding me of the power of courage and resilience. Your story will inspire others. I promise." And so, the journey continued, each day bringing them closer to the truth. The old man's story was no longer forgotten, it was alive, waiting to be shared with the world. And the young man knew that he had been given a gift, a chance to honor a hero who had been overlooked for far too long. With the old man's permission, the young man began to write the book. He spent hours each day at his desk, carefully crafting each chapter, ensuring that the old man's voice and experiences were preserved. It was a labor of love, but it was also emotionally draining. The weight of the old man's story was heavy, and the young man often found himself pausing to wipe away tears or take a deep breath. As he wrote, he began to share snippets of the story with the townsfolk. At first, they were skeptical. The old man had been a quiet, unassuming figure for so long that it was hard for them to imagine him as a war hero. But as the young man shared more details, stories of bravery, sacrifice, and resilience, they began to see the old man in a new light. One evening, the young man organized a small gathering at the town hall. He invited the townsfolk to come and hear a part of the old man's story. To his surprise, the hall was packed. People of all ages came, curious to hear about the man they had known only as a quiet neighbor. The young man stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding. He had never spoken in front of such a large group before, but he knew this was important. He began to read a chapter from the book, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke of the old man's courage, his leadership, and the sacrifices he had made. He described the battles, the losses, and the moments of hope that had kept the old man going. As he read, the room fell silent. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on the young man. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted into applause. The young man looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. He had done it, he had brought the old man's story to life. After the gathering, the townsfolk began to approach the old man, shaking his hand and thanking him for his service. The old man was overwhelmed by the attention, but he could see the respect and admiration in their eyes. For the first time in decades, he felt a sense of belonging, a connection to the community he had lived in for so long. The young man continued to work on the book, but he also began to think about how else he could share the old man's story. He reached out to local newspapers and radio stations, pitching the story as a human interest piece. To his delight, they were eager to hear more. Soon, the old man's story began to spread beyond the town, reaching people across the region. One day, a reporter from a major newspaper came to interview the old man. The young man was nervous, worried that the old man might feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable. But to his surprise, the old man handled the interview with grace and humility. He spoke openly about his experiences, his voice steady and his eyes filled with a quiet strength. The article was published a few days later, and it quickly went viral. People from all over the country were moved by the old man's story. Letters and emails began to pour in, thanking him for his service and sharing their own stories of loved ones who had served in the war. The old man was overwhelmed by the response, but he was also deeply touched. For the first time in his life, he felt that his sacrifices had been acknowledged and appreciated. As the days passed, the young man and the old man continued to work together. They spent hours talking, not just about the war but about life, love, and the passage of time. The old man shared stories of his childhood, his dreams before the war, and the life he had built afterward. The young man listened, captivated by the wisdom and humility of the man before him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, the old man turned to the young man and said, "You've given me something I thought I'd lost, a sense of purpose. Thank you." The young man smiled, his heart full. "No," he said. "Thank you. For trusting me with your story. For reminding me of the power of courage and resilience. Your story will inspire others. I promise." And so, the journey continued, each day bringing them closer to the truth. The old man's story was no longer forgotten, it was alive, waiting to be shared with the world. And the young man knew that he had been given a gift, a chance to honor a hero who had been overlooked for far too long. The old man's story had now reached far beyond the quiet town where he had lived in obscurity for decades. The newspaper article had sparked a wave of interest, and soon, television crews and journalists began arriving at his doorstep. The young man, who had become the old man's unofficial spokesperson, helped manage the influx of attention. He made sure the old man was comfortable and that his story was told with the respect and dignity it deserved. One morning, a national news channel arrived to film a segment about the old man's life. The crew set up cameras in his modest living room, and the old man sat in his favorite armchair, dressed in a simple but neat shirt. The young man stood nearby, offering silent support. As the interview began, the old man spoke with the same quiet humility that had touched so many. He recounted his experiences in the war, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke of the friends he had lost, the battles he had fought, and the quiet life he had built afterward. When the interviewer asked him how it felt to finally have his story recognized, the old man paused, his eyes glistening with tears. "It's strange," he said softly. "For so long, I thought no one cared. But now, knowing that people are listening, it means more than I can say." The segment aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Viewers from across the country were moved by the old man's story. Social media was flooded with messages of gratitude and admiration. People shared their own family stories of war and sacrifice, creating a wave of connection and remembrance. The old man, who had once felt invisible, was now a symbol of courage and resilience. But with the newfound attention came challenges. The old man, who had lived a quiet and solitary life for so long, found the constant stream of visitors and media requests exhausting. The young man noticed the toll it was taking on him and decided to step in. He began to limit the number of interviews and visits, ensuring that the old man had time to rest and reflect. He also helped the old man sort through the letters and gifts that poured in, reading them aloud and sharing the heartfelt messages from strangers who had been touched by his story. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a woman who had lost her grandfather in the same war. She wrote about how the old man's story had helped her understand her grandfather's sacrifices and had given her a sense of closure. The old man listened as the young man read the letter, his eyes filling with tears. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I never thought my story could mean so much to someone I've never met." As the weeks passed, the young man continued to work on the book, weaving together the old man's memories with the historical context he had gathered. He also began to plan a special event, a ceremony to honor the old man and his comrades. He reached out to local officials, veterans organizations, and community leaders, and together, they began to organize a day of remembrance. The ceremony was held in the town square, which was decorated with flags and banners. A stage was set up, and chairs were arranged for the attendees. The young man had invited the old man's fellow veterans, as well as their families, and many of them traveled from far and wide to be there. The old man, dressed in a suit for the first time in years, sat on the stage, his hands resting on his knees. The young man stood beside him, ready to offer support if needed. The ceremony began with a speech from the town's mayor, who spoke of the importance of remembering the sacrifices of those who had served. Then, the young man took the stage. He spoke about the old man's life, his bravery, and the impact his story had had on so many people. He also spoke about the importance of preserving history, of ensuring that the stories of those who had fought and sacrificed were never forgotten. When it was the old man's turn to speak, the crowd fell silent. He stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and looked out at the sea of faces. For a moment, he seemed overwhelmed, but then he took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was soft but steady, and his words carried the weight of decades of silence. He spoke of his comrades, of the bonds they had shared, and of the losses they had endured. He spoke of the importance of remembering not just the victories but also the sacrifices, the lives that had been changed forever. When he finished, the crowd rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. The old man stood there, his eyes filled with tears, as the young man placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a moment of recognition, of gratitude, and of healing. After the ceremony, the old man was surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand, thank him, and share their own stories. He listened patiently, his heart full. For the first time in his life, he felt that his sacrifices had been acknowledged, that his story had mattered. As the sun set that evening, the old man and the young man sat together on the porch, just as they had so many times before. The old man turned to the young man and said, "Thank you. For everything. You've given me more than I ever thought possible." The young man smiled, his heart full. "No," he said. "Thank you. For trusting me with your story. For reminding me of the power of courage and resilience. Your story will inspire others. I promise." And so, the journey continued, each day bringing them closer to the truth. The old man's story was no longer forgotten, it was alive, waiting to be shared with the world. And the young man knew that he had been given a gift, a chance to honor a hero who had been overlooked for far too long. The ceremony in the town square had been a turning point. The old man, who had once lived in the shadows, was now a celebrated figure, not just in his small town but across the country. His story had touched countless lives, and the young man who had uncovered it felt a deep sense of fulfillment. But as the initial wave of attention began to settle, the young man realized that their work was far from over. The old man's story was not just about the past, it was about the present and the future, about ensuring that the lessons of his life would continue to inspire others. The young man decided to take the old man's story to schools and universities. He believed that young people, who had only read about the war in textbooks, needed to hear first-hand accounts to truly understand its impact. He reached out to educators and arranged for the old man to speak at local schools. At first, the old man was hesitant. He had never spoken to large groups of young people before, and he wasn't sure how they would react. But the young man reassured him, reminding him of the power of his story. The first school visit was at a high school in a nearby town. The auditorium was filled with students, their faces curious and attentive. The young man introduced the old man, sharing a brief overview of his life and his heroism during the war. Then, he handed the microphone to the old man. The old man stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly. He looked out at the sea of young faces and took a deep breath. "When I was your age," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I never imagined I would be standing here, telling you my story. I was just a young man, like many of you, with dreams and hopes for the future. But life had other plans." He spoke of the war, of the friends he had lost, and of the moments of courage and fear that had defined his experience. He shared stories of camaraderie and sacrifice, of the bonds that had been forged in the heat of battle. But he also spoke of the aftermath, the struggles he had faced returning to a world that had moved on without him, the silence that had surrounded his story for so long. The students listened intently, their eyes wide with fascination. When the old man finished, there was a moment of silence before the auditorium erupted into applause. Afterward, many students approached him, shaking his hand and thanking him for sharing his story. One young girl, her eyes filled with tears, said, "Your story made me realize how much we take for granted. Thank you for reminding us of the sacrifices that were made for us." The old man was deeply moved. He had never imagined that his story could have such an impact on young people. As they left the school, he turned to the young man and said, "Maybe this is why I'm still here. To remind them of what we went through, so they don't forget." The young man nodded, his heart full. "You're making a difference," he said. "More than you know." Over the next few weeks, they visited several more schools. Each time, the old man's story resonated deeply with the students. Teachers reported that his visit sparked meaningful discussions about history, sacrifice, and the importance of remembering the past. The young man began to document these visits, capturing the reactions of the students and the impact of the old man's words. He knew that these moments were an important part of the story, a testament to the enduring power of the old man's legacy. But as the old man's story continued to spread, the young man began to think about what would happen next. The book was nearly complete, and he knew it would reach an even wider audience. But he also knew that the old man's story deserved more than just words on a page. He wanted to create something lasting, something that would ensure the old man's legacy would live on for generations. He began to explore the idea of creating a memorial or a scholarship in the old man's name. He reached out to local officials and community leaders, pitching the idea of a monument that would honor not just the old man but all the unsung heroes of the war. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and soon, plans were underway to create a memorial in the town square. The young man also worked with educators to establish a scholarship fund for students interested in studying history or pursuing careers in public service. The fund would be named after the old man, a tribute to his courage and his commitment to preserving the truth. As the plans for the memorial and the scholarship took shape, the old man watched with quiet pride. He had never sought recognition or fame, but he was deeply touched by the efforts to honor his legacy. One evening, as they sat on the porch, he turned to the young man and said, "You've done so much for me. More than I ever could have imagined." The young man smiled. "It's not just for you," he said. "It's for everyone who has ever felt forgotten. Your story is a reminder that every life matters, that every sacrifice counts." The old man nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I never thought my story would mean so much to so many people," he said softly. "But you've shown me that it's not just my story, it's ours. It's the story of everyone who fought, everyone who sacrificed, everyone who was forgotten." The young man placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "And now," he said, "it's a story that will never be forgotten." As the sun set that evening, casting a warm glow over the porch, the two men sat in comfortable silence. The old man's story had come full circle, from obscurity to recognition, from silence to celebration. And the young man knew that their journey together had only just begun. There was still work to be done, stories to be shared, and lives to be touched. But for now, they were content to sit together, two unlikely friends bound by a story that had changed both of their lives forever. The memorial in the town square was unveiled on a crisp autumn morning. The air was filled with a sense of anticipation as people gathered to witness the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. The young man stood at the center of it all, his heart swelling with pride as he looked at the monument that had been erected in honor of the old man and his comrades. The memorial was simple yet powerful, a stone pillar engraved with the names of those who had served, their sacrifices immortalized for generations to come. The old man, dressed in his best suit, sat in a chair near the monument, his cane resting by his side. His eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of the people who had come to honor him and his fellow soldiers. There were veterans, their families, students, teachers, and townsfolk, all united by a shared sense of gratitude and respect. The young man approached the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he began to speak. "Today, we gather to honor a man whose story was almost lost to time," he said, his words carrying across the square. "A man who, for decades, carried the weight of his sacrifices in silence. But his story is not just his own, it is the story of countless others who fought, who sacrificed, and who were forgotten. This memorial is a testament to their courage, their resilience, and their enduring legacy." He turned to the old man, his voice softening. "And to the man who inspired all of this, thank you. Thank you for trusting me with your story. Thank you for reminding us of the power of courage, of humility, and of the human spirit. Your story will live on, not just in this monument, but in the hearts of everyone who hears it." The crowd erupted into applause as the young man stepped aside, allowing the old man to take the podium. The old man stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and looked out at the sea of faces. For a moment, he seemed overwhelmed, but then he took a deep breath and began to speak. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "For so long, I thought my story didn't matter. But you've shown me that it does. That every story matters. That every sacrifice, no matter how small, has meaning." He paused, his eyes filling with tears. "This memorial isn't just for me. It's for all of us, for the friends I lost, for the comrades who stood by my side, and for the generations who will come after us. It's a reminder that we must never forget. That we must always honor the past, so we can build a better future." The crowd listened in silence, moved by the old man's words. When he finished, they rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. The old man stood there, his heart full, as the young man joined him at the podium. Together, they unveiled the memorial, the sunlight glinting off the engraved names. As the ceremony came to an end, the crowd began to disperse, but many stayed behind to take a closer look at the memorial. The old man and the young man stood together, watching as people traced the names with their fingers, their faces filled with reverence. It was a moment of connection, of remembrance, and of hope. In the weeks that followed, the memorial became a focal point for the town. People came from far and wide to pay their respects, to learn about the old man's story, and to reflect on the sacrifices of those who had served. The scholarship fund also began to take shape, with students applying for the opportunity to study history and public service in the old man's name. The young man continued to work on the book, adding the final touches to ensure that the old man's story was told with the care and respect it deserved. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the old man turned to the young man and said, "You've done so much for me. More than I ever could have imagined." The young man smiled. "It's not just for you," he said. It's for everyone who has ever felt forgotten. Your story is a reminder that every life matters, that every sacrifice counts." The old man nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I never thought my story would mean so much to so many people," he said softly. "But you've shown me that it's not just my story, it's ours. It's the story of everyone who fought, everyone who sacrificed, everyone who was forgotten." The young man placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "And now," he said, "it's a story that will never be forgotten." As the sun set that evening, casting a warm glow over the porch, the two men sat in comfortable silence. The old man's story had come full circle, from obscurity to recognition, from silence to celebration. And the young man knew that their journey together had only just begun. There was still work to be done, stories to be shared, and lives to be touched. But for now, they were content to sit together, two unlikely friends bound by a story that had changed both of their lives forever. The old man's story was no longer forgotten. It was alive, a beacon of hope and resilience, a reminder of the power of courage and the importance of remembering. And as the young man looked out at the horizon, he knew that the old man's legacy would endure, inspiring generations to come.